So next we have under the heading The Object as Organizer, Julia Bryan Wilson and Zoe Sheehan Saldana. And I'll very briefly introduce both of them while they come up here and take their place. Julia Bryan Wilson is an associate professor in the History of Art Department at the University of California, Berkeley. And she focuses on modern contemporary art, especially post-war art, feminism, queer theory, performance, and craft histories, and art in the nuclear age. She's done some very, very interesting work regarding art in the nuclear age and symbols and signage. And she has a book project right now called Craft, Crisis, Handmade Art and Activism Since 1970. And Zoe Sheehan Saldana, he is an artist based here in New York City. She looks at the shifting value of the handmade in art, and the dynamic between high and low art forms, the imperfect and often additive nature of copying and reproduction, and the multiple roles of the audience in the art experience. So without much further ado, I would like to hand it over to Julia Bryan Wilson and Zoe Sheehan Saldana. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to start by thanking Karen and Annie and Lara for the invitation. I know we're both really honored to be here. And I just want to say we're having a little bit of a shift moving into the moment of late capitalism in the United States, with the sort of Soviet productivist moment being kind of an echo and it very much informing our conversation, but that's not where we're going to stay. Because we're going to have a conversation primarily about Zoe's work and then open it up for a Q&A that hopefully will get through speedily. So I just want to set us up a tiny bit because we were given the charge to think through this question of the object as organizer. And just to say that I was asked to be in conversation with any artist that I thought appropriate, and very much thinking about Christina Kiaer's groundbreaking and hugely influential work on fashion and feminism and the mass-produced object and what those things, how those consumer objects might have affective connections. I thought immediately of Zoe's work as someone who's really interested in thinking about consumer culture and thinking about intimate fabrication, not in the realm, I don't think really, not in the realm of appropriation, as someone like, say, Josephine Mexiper or Jeff Koons might be approaching these questions, but really thinking about it in terms of value and care, material labor, embodiment, the feminization of labor, et cetera. So questions that are also very important to me. So I think we're going to sort of start with a really critical project that Zoe's been working on, and why don't you just sort of walk us through it, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, so I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for organizing the event, and I'm especially happy that Julia and I have an opportunity to do this together.
We finally just met yesterday for the first time ever.
in real life meeting. You know, we have an internet relationship, but and follow each other's work. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what you're seeing here. This is an image of a Walmart store, and so in about 2003, I embarked on a collaboration with Walmart, although they didn't really know that they were collaborating with me. And I would go to a Walmart store, and in this case, when I began, I was working with the Walmart in Berlin, Vermont, which is sort of near Barrie, Montpelier area, if anybody goes up there. And in many ways, it's kind of an atypical Walmart store because they don't get to have their own look exactly, but it's the only Walmart that was around me, and I was curious about this site because if you were living in that part of Vermont, there was nowhere for a woman to buy clothing that would be considered fashion forward in any sort of a way. Like there was a lot of flannel and wool, but Walmart is where you would go. And so I thought, well, what would you want to find in a Walmart in an ideal world? And so then I thought I needed to put it there because it kind of wasn't there. And so then I embarked on this, and it was a little bit of like an adventure. I didn't really know what I was getting into. So what I would do is go to Walmart and I would buy clothing. I tended to work with clothing that was my size and in terms of taste, sorry, but that's my taste. And I would buy things, so I bought the shirt that you see on the left there, and I brought that back to my studio where I would try to faithfully reproduce the object, both in terms of pattern and fabrics and embellishments, to the extent possible. I mean, I had to do it relatively quickly, so there were some limitations. But so I would create a handmade duplicate of an original Walmart mass-produced object, and then take the price tag and the garment tag from the original mass-produced object and put it in my handmade duplicate. And then I would also make a life-size, like a large high-resolution scan of my handmade duplicate. And at that point, I would take my handmade duplicate back to the store and just go in and put it on the rack so that unsuspecting Walmart customer could purchase a handmade knockoff of a Walmart mass-produced object for the original Walmart price.
Let's just linger on this
Okay.
for a second. Because there's so many, this
Excellent.
work raises
Let's
so many
pause.
interesting questions for me in terms of alternative means of distribution, for one thing, in terms of rethinking the value structure of art versus mass-produced commodity, questions of taste, obviously. You have this great detail that really shows the care that goes into your replications. So I just have so many questions about this, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your research process in some ways, like how you, I think it's great that you chose things that you would have ordinarily bought for yourself, but then how did you exactly go about the process of this exact duplication? And how important was it to you that this match be accurate?
I wanted it, like I said, to be faithful. With that in mind, it wasn't possible for me to do this in such a way that it would be completely the same, that it would be an exact duplicate. This was for reasons that mainly had to do with speed. I needed to get my work back in the store before the inventory cycle switched and they started remaindering and then sending to Africa or wherever they send, their remaindered clothing. This is still a mystery to me, but it like comes and goes very quickly. And I wanted to get my piece back in within that cycle. So there were some initial pieces that I made that were a little less successful, and which I don't include here. They're like the reject pile. But I figured out a technique for copying the clothing without destroying the clothing.
So you would not, take things apart to make a pattern?
I didn't take the clothing apart because I wanted it to be intact. When I show the work in a gallery or museum setting, I show the original Walmart item alongside a life-size photograph of my duplicate, and I didn't want there to be any intervention in the original item except that the tag is moved from one to the other. So I had to come up with some techniques, but this is something that's not terribly unusual if you're in the garment world of figuring out how to copy without destroying that precious garment. Yeah.
I just want to echo a little bit what happened in the last hour to say that I think it's interesting to think about this work in relationship to, say, Popova, because you weren't functioning as an artist as a kind of laboratory space for new objects, but you're really thinking about how we can re-signify ones that already exist. And I'm wondering if you could just speak more to that.
Well, to me, what sort of started as just to see if I could do this. This was kind of this is a question that propels me in a lot of my work. Is like, oh, can I do that? Oh, maybe. But from that point, then I started sort of saying, well, what is this? And thinking about what I do in relation to the original object. And so it became clear to me fairly quickly that I wasn't doing anything terribly different than what had been already done to make the clothing. Clearly, I was making, in a way, a prototype where they were making, multiple, but the act of making is still largely, there's a lot of hand involved. I mean, there might not be decisions about the design, but in terms of the production, there's a lot of hand involved. So to me, there was a kind of parallel going on, not a symmetry, but a sort of weird, like distorted reflection between my work as an artist and then the work that had gone into making this object. So it didn't really matter in a way what the object was. I wasn't trying to redesign the object. I was just trying to do my best to sort of repeat it within limitations. And so that became kind of an odd question for me of like, what am I doing here?
Right. I mean, to me, these objects are interestingly also this sort of transit point between the future, like you put it back into the store and it circulates in a way that you can't trace. So you have no knowledge of where it goes, which is somewhat unusual, I think, in a kind of art world market structure. But it's also a transit point in terms of thinking about its own history, its own material history, its own history of labor and work. And here you are kind of re-embodying in a completely different context the act of its own making. And I wonder how much research you did or how curious you got about the actual conditions under which these objects are made, you know, the factories in the Pearl River District, et cetera. And a piece like this, which, you know, so strongly made me think of the documentary China Blue about jeans factories in China, et cetera.
I was interested in that, but I didn't. I kind of wanted to take the object where it presented itself to me, and I didn't. There were a lot of things I sort of decided to not do. I mean, one of which was to track what happened to my piece when I put it back in, and another was to track like everything that went into making the object before it came to me. I think I was also curious about what happened when this work went back into the system of art distribution and how this work might maybe reflect a little, like might make a connection between a Walmart and, say, a museum or a gallery. And that to me was a more kind of curious and compelling question than the work of uncovering sweatshop labor. I mean, not that that's not a very valid thing to explore. It just wasn't my subject, I guess.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, this is a good shot to show how these things are displayed. So it's the actual, sort of the Walmart object, and then the photograph of your handmade reproduction on the gallery wall. And I'm actually really interested in how you have decided to display these in terms of your relationship to photography. I know you were trained as a photographer, and these, of course, make me think of Joseph Kosuth and a lot of the really classic conceptual investigations about iconicity and sign and referent and the photograph of the chair, an actual wooden chair, the definition of a chair. So were those things also happening in your head?
Yeah, I mean, I studied photography as a graduate student, and I sort of struggled with the question of what to make a picture of, because this is like, you can make a picture of anything, you know, and so I never gravitated towards like making a picture of something. But then I was very interested in pictures as objects and how they can be both an image and an object, and there's sort of a thing and an idea about a thing all at the same time. They're very odd creatures. So in this particular work, I sort of, I mean, the work exists in different places with different audiences. So there's the handmade duplicate that I made and put back in the Walmart store where it's available for purchase, but the knowledge of its origin is obscured, or is, unless you know something about garment construction, you're not really going to identify this object as being handmade, hopefully. And then that work, that handmade piece, was sort of sent out there without the life support of information. to an audience that was prepared to accept it as a Walmart mass-produced item of clothing. In turn, then I could take these pieces, which were in many ways two modes of reproducing my original, which in itself was a knockoff, so whatever, but two modes of reproducing my original and presenting them along with the information, the story about their provenance, as it were. And that in turn animated the piece which was gone.
Right.
So it was that whole cycle. I see all of that as the work, although not everyone has access to it all the time.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting to me to think about also how your labor is valued so differently from the people, from the primarily female hands that are making, you know, the Walmart object to begin with, and yet you're reversing those value structures by putting the Walmart one into the art context and putting yours back.
And this with the underwear is a particularly lovely example because there was some reaction to underwear that there wasn't to other things. So like there were people who would say, this is dirty, she shouldn't be allowed, you know, this is criminal, this is dirty. And then
meaning like perverted,
like,
or
I had my
unhygienic?
hands on your underwear, you know what I mean? And I was just kind of like, who do you think has their hands on your underwear? You know? And so that was interesting to me, that moment where it was like, yeah, right, this is what we don't want to think about. And that was like, okay, now I know what we're doing here.
Right. I mean, it was a very intriguing suggestion, Seth's kind of provocation that thing theory now has kind of come about because of a reaction maybe to post-colonial critique. I thought that was very interesting, that you can kind of objectify objects in a way that you can't comfortably objectify people. And I think how I'm thinking of it in terms of thing theory, which has a lot to do with also recent turns to kind of craftivism and the handmade in our current climate, is also about how objects either both efface and retain traces of their own making. So very much about, you know, thinking of questions of labor in a landscape really so marked by mass manufacturing, where so much of that labor is kind of not necessarily in our sight, although I think it exists in these kind of peripheral realms for us. And I think that question of like whose hands have been on your underwear is really
and it's
forces us to think about that.
It's a kind of pointing in a way that I think sort of cycling back to your question about photography. When photography is working, I think a lot of times what it's doing is pointing. I mean, obviously there are as many ways to work with photography as you can imagine, but in kind of the classic sense that you have this index of, anyway, there's a kind of pointing and framing that's happening, a calling attention. And in that way also I think this operates following that sort of metaphor.
Can I ask maybe this is always seen as a slightly rude question
I love rude
in this?
questions.
Right.
Ask
do
away.
these sell?
Oh, I hope so. I hope so.
I mean, so like not yet.
Do they sell? Oh, do the pieces in the gallery? I thought you meant do they sell in the Walmart?
Well, actually, both are interesting questions.
Okay,
Like,
so
you don't really know about the
in the Walmart. I
ones.
don't really know, except if I went back and maybe I might take something in, and then maybe a week later I take something else in, so I could kind of see was it still on the shelf. So I can say that in the Walmart they don't always remain on the shelf. What happens to them, I don't know. Then I try and close the loop here by selling in the gallery, selling the piece as you see it here. And so far there's been one dealer who actually knows how to sell this, and she has sold at least one piece. But it's a hard thing for people to figure out how to sell, I think, too. Yeah. But if anyone wants one.
I was asking more for the intellectual question of
Come on, Julia. I thought you were making business plans.
So this was the last, am I right that this is the last piece you did in this series?
I made some work after this, but this was the piece that made me stop doing it.
Do you want to explain what happened there?
Yeah. So this was a hat that, it's a reversible hat with this sort of Hawaiian print. And in trying to make this piece and then figuring out how to represent the piece, how to show the piece, the only way that made sense somehow that worked was to have the photograph of the hat be on this mannequin head, and then to have the mannequin head mounted on a shelf on the wall. And this piece, when you see it in real life, only really works if you're standing in one specific place in front of the object and if you're at the right height. It's like this kind of mirroring that you see in the image here only works if you're in like the correct perspectival space. If you move to the side, you'll see the profile of the mannequin, but you'll still see the frontal in the photograph. You get what I'm saying here? So there was a problem that I had, that I had always been curious about this, how the image worked in this mode, in the representation of the work. And this piece kind of only worked in this very specific way, and at some point I realized this is becoming sculpture, this is coming off the wall, something's happening here, and I don't know what it is, and so I had to sort of stop. Yeah. It was a formal problem I could not resolve.
A formal crisis.
Yeah.
Crisis of the 3D.
It was a crisis.
Right. So I
Crise
taught
de
this
foi.
work very recently in this seminar that I'm teaching an undergraduate seminar right now about contemporary art and handicraft, and I showed your work in our very first class, sort of thinking ahead towards this conversation. And I had a student who was very insistent that the purchaser of your clothes at Walmart would, on some level, feel there was a difference. And maybe they would last, the shirt would last longer, or they would have there would be some charge, some affective kind of, extra surplus value imbued by you as an artist that would have been, that would be tangibly different. And she was very recalcitrant on this.
Yeah.
And I couldn't, what could I say? Like,
Right. Well, you could congratulate her on her faith in art.
Right.
I think that's sort of what it
That's
boils
basically
down
what
to.
it is, yeah.
And encourage her to be an art historian.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the work that you
Okay.
transitioned to.
So at that time of this problem that I was having with the works coming off the wall, I sort of had to stop and think about what was I doing. And, this is always a problem for us when you have to think. It's like, so anyway, I thought to myself, well, what I'm doing is I'm making matches, like making one thing match another. And then having thought that, I was like, oh, duh. So now what I have to do is make matches. Like this occurred to me, so this is how a lot of things happen, is like you're kind of, for me anyway, I'm going down one road, and then there's sort of this moment where it's like the side road, and then that's it, that's the place to go. And so I decided, okay, well, if I'm making matches, then I'd better make matches. And so I went and cut down a tree.
Right, and this is an amazing, now you're turning into an artisan who really starts with the raw materials. You're shearing your sheep yourself, kind of becoming
Literally.
a factory of one, totally unalienated, right, from your products.
Except, I have to have chainsaws and whatever. So yes. But yes, I was.
We say that obviously joking.
Okay.
There's irony in place there, yeah.
So I did have to start researching, how to make matches. Mm-hmm. That was kind of the next process.
And they start obviously with wood.
They do. They start with wood, and then I needed some expertise, and basically like a safe place to not blow myself up. So I teach in Baruch College, which is part of the City University of New York, and there are several other CUNY campuses, and I started sending random emails out to chemistry professors at CUNY colleges saying, I want to make matches, can you help me? I sent stuff out to fireworks companies too, but the only person who replied was this guy, Glenn, Dr. Glenn Kovac, who's a chemistry professor at City College, and he said, oh, this is how matches work. You take some oxidizer and some reducer and you put them together and then you make friction, and you like banged with a hammer to make some friction. And I knew this was going to all work out just fine. And so it, to me, was interesting also to go back into science in a way to come forward into art, because there's this moment of alchemy where science and art kind of merged in a way, and then they split. So I was curious about being in that place.
And so here's the lab, obviously.
Yes.
And the final product. And this is a life-size match.
Yes.
And I think it's fascinating how with this project you are echoing painting in a way, with the wooden support, and there's pigment, and there's gelatin, there's a binder. I mean, there is an interesting analogy there, or resonance. But these are obviously meant to be used, to be functional, as a kindle, for something else, as a catalyst for fire, obviously. So tell us about how these enter the marketplace.
Okay, so these are, the piece is called Strike Anywhere, and it's an edition of 500 life-size, so, life-size, handmade wooden matches that are functional. And they're priced at $19.99 per match. Again, an edition of 500. And they are priced in that way, both to sort of be, $19.99 is just a great number. But to be inexpensive for an artwork and expensive for a match. I was interested in the object as possessing some kind of potential function that then might be activated by the user, by the buyer, by its audience. And if they chose to activate it in a way to sort of test it, they would also be destroying it. So there was this sort of possibility, this potential. And I wanted that to be affordable as well. So maybe you might buy two.
So that people would potentially take up its potential promise.
Yes.
But to become the garbology of the future.
Yes, and I didn't want it to be like free, throwaway, free.
Right.
$19.99 is still means something. It's a few coffees. So, yeah.
And how has that price point worked?
I've
for
sold
you?
some of them. Mostly individual people. Like, I've shown this work in galleries, and again, it's like a hard, and maybe I just don't have the right something. I don't know it. But I have sold these to individuals. I still have several left. I'm not trying to sell my art today. But I think that what happens at the $19.99 price point is that there's a question of whether to take them seriously or not as art. And I was curious about that, too. If they
Or to take them seriously as matches.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they occupy this sort of weird quasi-space, which to me was interesting, because we're asked in art, we're sort of told, well, it's important that the artwork be useless. And this is a fetish thing that we do, and that in design it's important that the work be useful. And so I was kind of trying to embody both in the same object, depending on how you chose to view it.
So you showed us some kind of process photographs, the log and the forest and your chemist friend, et cetera. But I'm wondering more about how you work and how you think in terms, do you make sketches? Do you keep a journal? This is so kind of clean and final in some ways, and it enacts its own erasure of the labor, and how you present the shop dropping pieces also. I'd just love to have a little more access, I think, to kind of how you make these things.
I prototype a lot of things, so with the matches, it probably took more than a year to create this final sort of 500. Once you make one, it's easy to make 499 more, but making the one took a while. So there was a lot of research, like patent research, that kind of thing, and then sort of recipes. My notebooks are usually filled with recipes and sketches, and then prototypes. Like there's a storage unit in Brooklyn right now that has a lot of prototypes of these in there, and I always look at them and I'm like, I can't bear to throw them away, but they're not the piece. They're just a means to get to the piece for me.
I'm going to ask another rude question,
Excellent.
which is, just in a kind of post-conceptual era, why not just buy matches and say
Yeah.
you made them? I mean, why, if they are identical?
Are you sure I didn't?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, the year, the warehouse,
It's
I
a
mean, yeah,
good-
these are excellent.
it's a good
Yeah, these
story.
are good alibis, these photographs. They seem very staged and theatrical, I'll tell you. Yeah, they do. A little too much. But no, I'm actually serious. Like, what's your investment, I guess, in putting your own body through the paces of this making? I mean, how important is that embodiment to you as a pedagogical practice?
To me, as a maker, which I am interested in, I mean, this animates me. I don't expect that my process of making animates the viewer necessarily. I mean, it might not. But I am generally curious about things, the world, people, whatever. I'm a curious person. And I find that, like, I sit here and I'm like, oh, how did this happen?
Mm-hmm.
And then I've found that one way to figure out how, like, I love this grenade bottle. Like, how, who, what? So by remaking it, I learn about how it happened. And then, in a way, things start coming alive to me. They start telling stories to me about how they came to be. I don't see the objects as people. I see them as traces of, or sort of containers of, or embodiments of everything that went into making them. And this is fascinating to me. It makes the world come alive. And,
I mean, what you're saying is exactly thing theory, I think, but it's also really what we would call old-fashioned material culture, which is a long-standing field within that lies at the intersection, I think, of kind of anthropology and art history, which really is about how objects, bear they bear the traces of the story of their own past, and they embody history in all these interesting ways. And I guess, maybe over the course of the day, the sort of tension between thing theory and material culture studies will be more explored. I'm not sure we have the time to go into that. But so let's move on to this next edition.
Okay, so the matches sort of lit a body of work that, this is one example. It's called Paper Towels. It's an edition of 130 handmade, embossed, folded paper towels in a stainless steel dispenser. The dispenser is ready-made, it's store-bought, and the towels are handmade. And yeah, so...
So again, you're making original trash.
Well, they're not trash yet.
Yeah, right.
But they do have the potential to become trash. And actually, when I've shown this work, there have been occasions when viewers have just taken a piece and used it to wipe their face, and this is a beautiful moment for me. It usually makes the gallery owners a little ugh. But I think it's sort of wonderful that it passed.
Right.
Yeah. And I was conceiving of both, the match work and this, and then some subsequent work as objects that might potentially be useful in the event of some kind of an emergency, whether large or small. So you might need to light a fire, you might need to clean up a little bit of water, or you might have a lot of water, in which case you might want a life jacket.
And these are, the life jackets in particular, I mean, all of them are in kind of large editions, and I know you've said that you prefer them to be seen in this way, sort of
Yes.
conjuring an emergency at a bigger scale somehow.
Yeah, and with the potential to have a lot of people have their lives
Are these
saved.
like water ready? I mean, are these,
Well, yeah,
have
they're
you
not
tested
Coast
them
Guard
yet? Yeah.
approved, but I can say they float me very well, and they should float. The adult size should float an adult very well. They're made. Again, if you believe me, but they are made as faithfully as possible. So they're, as it says on the slide, they're nylon and polyester, and with the reflective tape, so when the helicopter comes over to get you, it'll see you. And then they're filled with milkweed fluff, which is a very buoyant fiber that was used during World War II in America as a ersatz stuffing, life jacket stuffing. Life jacket stuffing was used to be kapok, which is a fiber from a tree that grew mostly in the South Pacific. So during World War II, we didn't have much trade with the South Pacific, it turned out. So we needed other materials to float people, and we turned to milkweed fluff as one thing. So I was sort of interested in that moment.
So just continuing the theme of, imagined emergencies in a way, you turned next to almost more, interestingly also scientific project that involved you learning how to make ethanol.
Right. So I started learning or started distilling ethanol probably just, again, on a lark in a way, like, what's this about? And ethanol is moonshine. It's also what we add to gas to make it more like green friendly or whatever. And I was sort of curious about ethanol as a substance, and then also about the legal status of moonshine and the sort of, in a way, the false promise of a lot of what is marketed to us as green in some way. So I just sort of started distilling and made some ethanol, mostly from corn and barley. You can make ethanol from any kind of fruit or grain. But and then after a while, I had a lot of ethanol, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with this? And I thought about making perfume from it, and then I realized that what I needed to make from it was hand sanitizer, because to me this resonated.
With the emergency thought.
Yeah, and sort of with the contemporary moment, like ethanol, I don't know, maybe you see people walking around and they have like those little hand sanitizer pouches, and everyone's like, this motion of people doing is very Lady Macbeth, and as though we feel this is going to save us.
When actually it's probably making the drug, the bugs more resistant.
It could. I mean,
right?
alcohol's better than like other antimicrobials, but I just thought it's the futility of this. It's like, what can we do? Oh, we can sanitize. And this curious sort of powerlessness that we occupy, and then that we have a product to fill our powerlessness need, this was interesting to me. So as an object.
But say more about this form.
Okay, so in this case, what I did was I purchased a box of hand sanitizer, and I emptied the contents out of the existing bottles, and then I put my handmade hand sanitizer back in the packaging, and then boxed it up and donated the box to an organization that distributes care packages to deployed American military personnel. And I don't know where it went after I donated it. I am hopeful that the agency that makes the charitable contributions actually makes the charitable contributions, but I was sort of relying on them to get the product to its end point.
And why go to that method of distribution, like a charitable organization that...
Because I think it's another sort of curious, it's a place that we get to that shows all of our weirdness. Like, we send people off to fight in wars for us, and we don't adequately supply them, so then we rely on modes of charity to get individuals to give stuff so that the people can fight and die on our behalf. And I think this is a curious moment that we're at. And I also think it's a moment that involves a certain amount of faith. Like, we sort of have faith this is all just going to work out in a way. I mean, we don't want to think too much about it. So, and we have trust in this charitable system. There's also this sense of like giving something away that I was curious about. We tend to give away things that we don't want anymore. Like it's free means it's not worth anything. We give it away to charity when we don't want it. That was like, it just itched at me.
I'm just thinking about this phrase, the object objects that we heard a little while ago, and so much of the new materialism is about objects and their agency and really vivifying them. But sometimes your work, like this piece to me really seems to be theorizing the muteness, actually, of objects and their unknowability. I mean, even though you made this, you distilled the ethanol yourself, you put it back in the package, and then it goes into the world and circulates, and there's some ways in which we can't be accountable to it. It doesn't speak to us. We can't hear it, or what it isn't speaking, or I think that the idea of kind of miscommunication or thwarted communication is also very resonant in your work, because you don't trace where the things go. I think your kind of lack of curiosity about that is really astonishing and actually very generous.
I don't feel like I'm making something in order to necessarily change the problem. And maybe that's a fault of the work or just a fault of imagination on my part, but I'm much more interested in sort of just probing it in a way. And if the problem, in effect, is that so much of the world is invisible or obscured to us, maybe that's a problem that art can take on too. I mean, I'm really curious about making art that disappears.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good place to open things up to the audience. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Susanna Weigand. I actually wanted to take it back to an earlier point that you mentioned with your hands on underwear. And I just wanted to pause on any garment about the sort of haptic element that's going on. And when you're sewing or when you have a garment in your hands, I was just thinking that the garment basically is sort of in your possession. It's going to basically take a shape that you guide. But by the end of the process, the garment is on the rack, it's on the wall of the museum, and it's rather empowered. And I was wondering, what is that, if you could comment at all about do you think that these objects, when they make it to the museum wall or to the rack, is it a type of, do you see them as empowered at that moment? Or, like, that's one of my questions. And if the object does become empowered, is it a gradual process or does it instantaneously happen?
Do you want to say anything? Oh, darn. I don't know if the object is empowered. My sense personally, I mean, I don't feel like I contain the whole piece either. I want to make that quite clear. I do my part, and then I send something out there, and then it does something, and other people come and do something with it. I mean, I don't think the artist possesses the artwork. I think the audience very much possesses the artwork to an equal, if not greater, amounts. So perhaps to some degree it could become, and I may be mistranslating your use of the word empowered, but I think of it maybe like, does it speak? And I think it speaks if you listen. But I don't know that everyone's listening. I don't know if I've answered your question. It's just sort of reflecting back on it.
Well, when you say that it speaks, do you think it's the shape? Do you think it's the shape, the color, the vivacity that is appealing? Or is it more of sort of that handling it and its fabric and its materiality?
I think that if you notice it, it's speaking to you. Yeah.
I hear there's another question here.
Or you're speaking to it.
How did you develop the sewing and seamstress skills necessary to do the first?
I learned to sew from my grandmother and my mother when I was a child, like to sew basic things and to sew from patterns. And then luckily Walmart's clothing is very simple. It's not couture in any way. So I could sort of take it on, yeah. And then maybe I might read something, or like I subscribe to sewing magazines. But I, take clothes. I did a piece before this where I was taking people's Levi's jeans and remaking them. So I had some experience like taking clothing apart and then putting it back together. But mostly just self-taught or like family things, yeah.
Really interesting way that you invert the original and the copy here by making the handmade the copy and the original is the mass-produced. What I think is really interesting about your work is the way that it infiltrates and art. Here the art object has that subversive potential that many artists have wanted to have for all of modernity, definitely for the modern era. But I think that's what's really interesting, that the object infiltrates, in this case, in the case of Walmart, mass culture without its intent being apparent at all, and then you have this agent, which is almost in this case in particular that we're looking at. And the idea that you're sending this to the soldiers, it's almost like a terrorist artifact. They almost look like hand grenades, but apart from that, it made me think of when Tylenol was, when Tylenol was, I don't know if you remember, but when Tylenol was...
I'm old enough to remember.
Yeah, okay. Anyhow, I think this infiltration is like really, really interesting, and it really speaks to another way of making art that is not, well, that is just works in a different way, works through different circuits. And going back to the gallery exhibit that you had, I wanted to ask you, what was framed, the original or the copy?
Nothing is framed. The original piece that I bought from the Walmart hangs on the wall on a hanger on a hook, and then there's a photograph of my handmade duplicate, and that hangs on the wall.
Oh, okay. I thought those
there's a border around the photograph, but nothing is framed.
Okay, thank you.
Another question? Christina?
Ask her a question.
Okay. Well, I'm going to kind of comment, and then you can both say something if you want to. Just to kind of embody my role as the person who started out by talking about productivism, I just think that this is such an extraordinary project because it seems like it just kind of completely symmetrically reverses or stops the thing that was supposed to be set in motion by productivism. So that fantasy of mass production, that the dress that I talked about had this kind of weird handmade look. I didn't show a picture, but there's a picture of somebody who actually recreated the dress, sort of like you did, sort of at home as a seamstress. And it looks really weird, that blue and white dress, when it actually gets made. It makes you realize how awkward it is. And Julia, you were talking about how, sort of in material culture, it bears the traces of its making. But that for the productivists, the whole point was That's now, it's transitional, we're kind of trying to figure things out, but the goal is mass production, where it's not going to bear those traces, and that's the utopian goal. And that they're doing that from a moment where production is still a fantasy. It's early 20th century, and it's Russia. By then, of course, in England and New England with all the sweatshop factories, the mass production of dresses was not utopian, but it was at that time in Moscow. And so now, for us, when we live in this, just endless crates are flown over from China every day of things that are mass-produced, then the utopian gesture becomes to stop that process and to insert the handmade into it. So, I mean, I guess this is obvious, but I just thought I wanted to kind of spell that out. But then I was also thinking about your project, and this is maybe even almost a little bit flippant, but about what you chose not to do. And it struck me what Julia said about the muteness of your objects, that the Constructivists wanted their objects to be comrades and active and change people's lives. And you're kind of renouncing that and saying they're just going to be mute, I'm not even going to follow them. And it made me think about how that goes against so many other kinds of projects that you could have done. I don't know if you're familiar with the website, The People of Walmart. It's this horrible voyeuristic, have people seen it? Just incredibly, large, crazily dressed people in Walmart. It's a very snobby website. And one could imagine you sort of hiding amongst the clothing racks with your camera to find out who tried it on and who bought it. That one could it would be a different kind of thing. And then going back the other way, Julia mentioned the sweatshop labor that went into it, and that was not your concern. But I had a very cynical thought when you were talking about how could the gallerist market those pieces. Right now, I feel like one of the main consumer trends is that if you buy something, 10% of the value will be donated back to some poor person somewhere else, not here. One could imagine some kind of this is taken from sweatshop labor at Walmart, but if you buy my artwork, 10% will be donated back to the particular do you see what I'm saying? You're inserting yourself in a place, but you're kind of choosing not to participate in or have your objects speak in those directions, which I just thought was interesting.
Can I just have a comment to that comment, which I thought was really important, which is that I think one of the things that has impressed me about the Walmart project when I first learned about it was that it wasn't classist in a way that so many critiques of the people who go to Walmart can be. You were very upfront about that was where I was getting my clothes, this is my taste, I'm not, so there wasn't, it's not about a kind of taste-based critique of downwardly, the working class people who mostly do shop at Walmart or middlebrow folk or whatever. So that's something that I think is interesting, is refreshing in some way. And then I think, one thing that Zoe and I talked about and we couldn't decide what to do with it was this kind of opening quote that has now come up multiple times about the black and mournful slaves and how we both were a little uneasy with that as a freestanding sentence that was the epigraph to this conference because of its obvious racialization and how it didn't seem to be integrated into some of the rest of what the conference seemed to be about, and how we didn't know how to market in any kind of way except for now for me to say, and it has come up before, that I think your work too is also about the kind of racialization of mass production today, in terms of how much of that work, how many objects are made in China, and how different it is for you as a white American woman to be remaking those things, and how that obviously shifts the focus in a very interesting and I think a quite critical way. Do you have anything to?
Not specifically. Just I think there's also a craft moment that you know a lot about. Where the mark of the maker's hand, getting back to Christina's point, is foregrounded in a way that might be in opposition to, the mass production of objects, to sort of say, like all the Etsy shops in the world having these handmade things. And I have mixed feelings about that, as I do about most things, but I wonder if that's something that comes up for you in thinking about craft, the sort of craft moment that we're having now about the mark of the maker's hand.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that gets said about it, which is, this is about reclaiming making in an era when making has been outsourced or something, and it's about a kind of return to a sensual, material connection to the things that we use and need around us every day. And I think it's, I think that like everything, that can be a very overly simplistic understanding of what's actually happening. Where are you getting your fabric? How are you,
Right.
to sort of say like, oh, I'm really withdrawing from a market economy because I'm sewing my own clothes. It's like, well, how did you get to the store to buy your clothes?
Right.
How, all of that, to get the cloth to make your clothes, et cetera, et cetera. And then, so I think, for me, I think about the sort of craft revival that we're in right now as very much part of a kind of neoliberal turn towards individual entrepreneurialism, so it's very much about making your own little market on Etsy or having your own little booth at a craft fair and, niche marketing because there's a cachet for things to be unique and handmade. Which is a much longer, complicated question, but I think we actually have to take our break now, so we can, you can, of course, ask us questions over coffee, and thank you so much.
Thank you.